What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
America Trends podcasts and you, and we love that combination. We really do. I'm Larry Rifkin, along with John Krofsik. Hi, John.
How are you doing?
I'm good today. I really am. But this is going to be a day when we confront things that are difficult for all of us to confront, because it's rare for any person to want to be confronted and forced to address our own biases or prejudices in ways that reveal something about ourselves, John, that we perhaps even hid from ourselves.
Oh, this is interesting.
Ooh.
Now, we kind of did this in the color of law a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. When we talked about segregation and housing and the policy. But, John, I could imagine that if I were in one of Paul Kivel's classes and he said, okay, this exercise is going to be done in silence, and we're going to do that now with our audience, so you can wrestle with your own feelings as they surface. So here you go, AmericaTrendsPodcast.com. We begin with question 1. If your ancestors were forced to come to this country or forced to relocate from where they were living, either temporarily or permanently, or restricted from living in certain areas, take one step backward. Now, wait a minute. John, that could be difficult because you're surrounded by consoles and cabinets. I don't want you moving.
I can go back. I just can't go forward.
Okay, you can't go forward. Question 2. If you feel your primary ethnic identity is American, take one step forward. Now, who answers that as yes? I don't know.
Yeah.
Native Americans? I don't know. I mean, maybe somebody who's been here 5, 6 generations.
Right,
or
maybe.
what have you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Because everybody else, I'm a Polish American, I'm a this, I'm a that.
Right.
If you were ever called names or ridiculed because of your race, ethnicity, or class background, take one step backward. Question 4. If you grew up with people of color or working class people who were servants, gardeners, or babysitters in your house, take a step forward. Well, I think we all get the point that, we all have these life experiences that are just part of our being, and we never really put them in any context.
Never really think about it, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
There are a lot of things that are lodged, I think, in our subconscious that sometimes we need to bring forward to figure out why we feel the way we do. And I know that we all say, well, I'm not in any way prejudiced or racist or whatever, but is that really true? I mean, sometimes we're jogged to think about things. I mean, let me ask you, John, and not to put you on the spot, because I know we've all done it. If somebody's telling a joke at the expense of someone else or another group, I mean, have we always stopped and said, no, wait a minute, I don't want to hear that.
Right,
that's
right.
not right.
Yeah.
How many of us do that, really?
No, that's true. That's
well,
true.
If we're honest,
Yes,
we can't
true.
say that. Why do we accept ongoing segregation? Do we sometimes lock our doors if a young black male is walking by? I mean, I'm just posing these questions because they point to the fact that there is a prejudgment at times that goes on.
Oh, I think you're right. And I think the media helps to promote these prejudgments on the television. So, I think you're absolutely right on that.
Well, our guest today, Paul Kivel, has been trying to get us, primarily white people in the United States, for all of us to confront the institutions and organize ways that we can control, these things from becoming so much a part of the culture that we don't even identify them as issues. And that is what they call institutional racism, where we don't even recognize it. Now, John, you and I have worked together, and we've done it for a while, and we work together in a wonderful company, a small company, relatively speaking, but in a city that has become majority minority.
That's true.
And yet in this small company, just by dint of the fact that a lot of people have worked there for a long period of time, there's not one person of color. There's no one who's
That's
Latino.
True. But back when it started in 1934, and I think you're right, the longevity in this company is incredible. So
there are just things that occur that we just don't think about. I've never walked down the street as an African-American male when I was in my teens or 20s. I just don't even know what that feels like. I want to be better at understanding the experience, but it's really hard in the skin that I have. No? So I think what he's trying to do, what Paul's trying to do in this book, Uprooting Racism, and by the way, John, it's in its 4th edition. So he's had a lot of attention to this. He's done a lot of training, a lot of help to many to try to get us to bring some of these feelings that we have up to the surface. And I think he does a really good job of it in our podcast.
Yeah, well, I think we need to be aware of this and maybe start changing the way we think about these matters.
And I've got to tell you, the hardest question I think that he poses is this one. Do we, those of us who are in the majority, at least for the moment, do we actually benefit from participating in a kind of benign neglect of the status quo? I mean, do we really have our own reasons for not wanting to address these things? And he really confronts us with some of these really hard discussion points that often never get talked about.
Well, I think we better listen to this and get more knowledge.
All right. The book is called Uprooting Racism. And I hope this is something that really brings out some issues in your own way of thinking. It certainly has for John and for me. Well, joining us today on America Trends podcast is Paul Kivel, and he's written the book Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. And this is the revised and expanded edition. And Paul, tell us, I mean, you've been in this field and working for so many years. What's changed about this conversation?
The conversation around racism in the United States it changes periodically depending upon what's going on in the country and what people of color are doing to resist racism and what the pushback from white folks is. So, you know, we had a period in the during the civil rights period and immediately afterwards where white people were forced to confront the reality of racism and the devastating impact it had. And then we had some legislation that was passed and a lot of backlash to resisting that legislation. And then we had a long period where white people pretty much said, well, the civil rights movement took care of racism. It's no longer a problem. And then we had Obama as president, and during that period, there was tremendous backlash from white people against his administration, against him and his wife and administration. And white people again said, well, if we have a black president, what more can we do? And we must be in a post-racial society. And, of course, that's all fallen apart now because we have neo-Nazis in the street and an administration which is openly racial in its policies and behavior, and a lot of phone video of police brutality and the killing of people of color on our streets. So we're in a period where it's harder for white people to deny that there is racism, although polls still show that a majority of white people don't think racism is a major problem in our country, and a majority don't think it's happening in their neighborhood.
It's interesting. We had Richard Rothstein on recently, The Color of Law, talking about what the federal government's role has been in segregation. And it was de jure, not de facto, and pretty remarkable stuff. And John and I were both really stunned at the fact that we learned that our housing policy had intent by the government. And then at the same time, I'm reading where Ben Carson, who now heads HUD, and he himself being African-American, thinks that we need to look at any set-asides or we need to look at anything that might have a racial cast to it in terms of benefits to those who are of color. And where's this disconnect?
Well, I think that we still have a national leadership and public policy which reinforces racism every day, and it's in our institutions, in the educational system, the healthcare system, and in the media, etc. And we still have a narrative that we are an exceptional country and that we couldn't possibly have such a deep problem as racism, and therefore we have to blame individual people of color for their situation, or we have to deny that it's really as serious as it is. And a lot of people buy into that and accept that because it allows them to continue colluding with the system and sometimes benefiting from the system.
If you've lived in this society for as long as I have, 65 years, in white skin, and people talk about white privilege, what is it that we just don't even see ourselves because we take it so much for granted, where we have never felt the sting of racism?
That's a very good question. I think that there's a couple of factors. One is that as white people, we live very segregated lives for the most part. Our neighborhoods are highly segregated. Schools are highly segregated. Religious institutions are highly segregated. And even many of our workplaces are segregated. So we don't come into contact with people of color. We don't live around them, and therefore it's much easier to deny the information we get because it doesn't work with what we see around us. We can point to an exception or a media figure or a political figure that somehow represents for us how people of color are doing in general. And of course, there's been a heavy discourse in our public arena that if you mention race, then you are in fact being racist. You are in fact, so it's gotten so that if you even talk about or name what's going on as racist in some way, then you become in turn accused of stirring things up, of playing the race card, of being racist. And so that really puts a damper on our ability to talk about the issues honestly and directly.
Well, again, you referenced a post-racial society and a belief that a lot of white people have that the civil rights movement, we did that. We put legislation in place. We started a lot of programs to remediate problems. So it's done. We can take that off our list. And yet, when you think about it, are perhaps some of these issues inflamed because perhaps some of the programs that we did put in place are going to take a lot longer or need to be adapted to the times and haven't been as effective in what we had hoped they would do as we first imagined?
I think there's two things to keep in mind. Is the first one is that those programs were heavily resisted, and school districts, for instance, resisted desegregation orders. There was tremendous white flight to suburban schools or private schools. And in all areas that it wasn't that we made so much progress. We had in place the tools to make progress, but it was very slow and with tremendous resistance. But when we get to, more recent times, some of those programs were working very well, and part of the resistance is because, in fact, they did begin to make some changes. Affirmative action had some positive impact on employment practices and discrimination in the public sphere. And it was exactly at the point when it was being effective that the rug was cut out and white people began to resist and say, this is reverse racism. And so after centuries of affirmative action for white people, as soon as people of color get in the door starts to close, and pretty soon it's barely open anymore.
Yeah, help us with that. I mean, was it really during the Nixon era when we started hearing a lot of code words for law and order and the like, or even Ronald Reagan and others, welfare queens and so forth? I mean, when did we begin to push back against some of the things that most in our society, I think in the 60s, applauded, recognized that this was really a heinous system that we had in place? When did we begin to pull that string a little bit?
Well, I think you're right. It was in the 70s and 80s when it no longer became okay in the public arena to be openly racist, to say openly racial things, at least in certain public arenas. up till then, white people could do or say pretty much anything they wanted because there was no popular culture or opinion that disapproved. But when the civil rights legislation was passed and people became more sensitive to issues of race, it became not okay to say things directly, and so white people started using coded language. And some of the words you said, and others, we talk about inner city, welfare queen, immigrants, when we're really only talking about white immigrants of color. All of those are coded words for racial discrimination and exclusion, but they're harder to pin down, they're harder to name as such, and so they become a way that white people, we can collude with each other in talking about racism without naming it specifically.
We'll return to this episode of America Trends in just a moment. If you like what we're doing here at America Trends Podcast, please don't keep it to yourself. I know there are a lot of people, John, who think, well, if I'm listening and somebody else wants to listen at the same time, maybe we're going to collide and they're not going to be able to hear us. Yeah. Is that the way the technology works?
No, there's plenty of bandwidth. Everybody can listen at the same time.
All right. Well, that dispels that myth. Now, you can do a number of things that would really be helpful to us. You could give us a kind rating or a review at Apple Podcasts, and that boosts what they consider to be our value and visibility. And what does that do, John?
Well, that puts us in the forefront so that you can find us easier, and most important is other people can find us easier.
And you can subscribe there or on our site, americatrendspodcast.com, or wherever you're listening, so we can alert you to new episodes of the podcast, which, by the way, we put out twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And stay in touch with us on both Facebook and Twitter at Trends Podcast. Or you can like us on Facebook or follow us where, John?
On Twitter.
On Twitter, that's right, where the world turns to hear fake news or whatever it is. Well,
Not
you can
us,
direct
though.
message us at Trends Podcast or using hashtag Trends Podcast. And you know, John, with our growing audience, and really it's been pretty remarkable, a lot of people just came to us the last month or two, and they might have missed earlier episodes. Can they get them again?
They can look through them and pick the ones they want to listen to. They're all on the website, and a lot of them are up on iTunes, many of them.
All right. Well, listen, there's lots of material to listen to. We hope you have the time, and we'll lend it to us because we try to make it worth your while. And thanks so much for listening.
And tell your friends.
We now return to this episode of America Trends.
Well, you've got some provocative material in your book. If you look at the table of contents alone, only justice can put out the fire. And part one, what color is white? And people who say, well, I'm not racist because I don't feel that way in my heart. How do we become complicit in a society that has a lot of institutional biases, even when we don't think we are and don't want to be?
That's a good question, and I think that there's a couple pieces to that. First of all, we have to acknowledge there's massive evidence that there's racism in all of our institutions, in our schools, in our healthcare system, in the criminal legal system, in housing and job markets. We have to come to a point where we say, yes, there is racism in our country, and I have been, as a white person, through the schools, through religious organizations, through the media, I've been socialized into that. And so I've got some work to do as a person with integrity. I don't want to walk around discriminating against people, stereotyping people, marginalizing people because of misinformation that I've learned. So there's some personal work to do there that we have to admit is part of the work. But racism is locked into our system at the institutional level. So it's not, the focus isn't whether you're racist or not or whether I'm racist or not. The focus should be on what can we do together to start making some changes with people of color in the lead to address the institutional racism that exists in our society. And we can get bogged down. I mean, none of us wants to be racist or to feel like we're being accused of being racist. We need to kind of take the emphasis off the individual and put it on our institutions and say, what can we do together to create more equal opportunity and justice in our society.
And what is the role of a white individual who really has that inclination to be helpful and to break down some of these institutional barriers, working with the black community? I mean, what is the proper alignment there?
I wrote my book, Uprooting Racism, specifically as a kind of a toolkit for white people, with lots of exercises and questions and information and history and stories and guidelines, so that we can get wherever we are in the process, we can move along and begin to be more public, more active. We can break the silence that so often we collude with, and we can begin to work with people of color-led organizations who have always been more on the front lines of working for racial justice. The first step is the one I just mentioned, is breaking the silence and acknowledging that, in fact, there is racism in our society on serious and devastating levels, that we have a mutual interest. It impacts our communities and our lives, as well as having a major effect on people of color. So this isn't about being charitable. It's about understanding that our society is being undermined by systematic inequality, which allows great inequalities in wealth in our country, so that all of us who are poor or working or middle class are experiencing the impact of that, but we can't work together with each other because we're divided along racial lines.
It's interesting that we're talking about this. I was just talking to somebody who took my position. I was a talk show host in this community, and we had at-large election of aldermen in a city of over 100,000 people. And they had tried for years to make it a district approach, but there was a lot of pushback from a lot of the existing power structure in the community and those who really wanted to leave things the way they were. And now they're going through their first election through this district process. And I guess I was being assailed on the air today, even though I left the program several months ago, because I fought so hard to bring the power back to the neighborhoods. And it was something that the African American community tried for years, but I kind of took it out of that realm and made it an issue of justice for these communities and taking power back from City Hall. But it's a really hard one, issue, and any of these issues there's incredible resistance.
Of course, but there's also more and more white people who are waking up to the impact that racism has on our lives, so there's also more opportunities at this point to get involved. So after we're more aware and looking at how racism impacts our communities, we start asking questions. Why is this neighborhood all white? What's the history there? How are people of color kept out of it? Why is this healthcare system having such a disproportionate impact on people of color via white people? And then once we start asking those questions, we're breaking the silence around racism, and we're beginning to connect with other people who are also concerned about these issues. And we begin to look around for organizations that are working on redistricting or healthcare equity or reform of the schools. So there's kind of a progression of steps for white people to take, from being more aware to getting more involved to being really engaged in more of community-based processes for social justice.
What do you say to those who do throw out the canard, I think it is, but about Barack Obama and saying, well, we did it. I mean, we elected 2 times an African-American gentleman to be president of the United States. So how can you say we're a racist society? What do you say to that?
Well, I think the evidence is in the statistics about our health care and the disproportionate arrest, racial profiling, racial harassment, police murder of people of color, the lack of, if we look at the major corporations, the major political parties, we look at the heads of foundations and think tanks, white people are in charge. And people of color are disproportionately represented as marginalized groups who have less access and are represented negatively in the media. I mean, almost anywhere we look in our society, we can see the direct impact of racism. And so it's kind of a distraction to say, well, one person made it. We could point to Oprah Winfrey, or, that's one thing we can do as white people to deny racism, is to try to pick out a few examples that are the exception and say that they're really the rule.
You talk about the costs of racism to white people. Evidently, a lot of people don't think necessarily that they have paid a price, and they push back when, in fact, there might be gains being made. So what has the price been?
The price is on several levels. For one, I mean, when environmental waste is dumped into communities of color, for instance, or our civil liberties or our welfare payments are cut back because of stereotypes about black people being on welfare when the majority of people on welfare are white, then our white communities are more toxic. Our support for poor and working class white folks is lower. Our healthcare system is, very, very malfunctioning and dysfunctional. That in each of these areas, we are not immune from the impact of racial injustice. And we now face a society in which there's tremendous inequalities, and there is a 1% who are the ones that call the shots in so many of the areas of our lives. And we cannot unite and really rebalance the economy of our country if white people are constantly being directed our attention towards recent immigrants or Muslims or African Americans, rather than at the wealthy white men who are at the top of the economic pyramid. And finally, just in the level of our virtue and our integrity, if people are getting abused and marginalized and exploited around us, and we aren't doing anything about that, then that says something about who we are as people, and where our compassion lies or doesn't lie, and where our integrity lies or doesn't lie. And so I think there's multiple levels of cost. One of the ways to think about that is think about who made your clothes, who made your computer and cell phone, who grows the food that you eat and processes it and cooks it, who cleans our buildings. Our lives are intimately interrelated and interdependent with people of color, and when they're exploited and we're sitting here enjoying the benefits of these clothes and electronics goods and food, then our integrity and moral virtue is seriously compromised.
You have got a section on the geography of fear and fear itself. I mean, a lot of people might think that a lot of the problems that we're talking about today are left best to the South, though we had another guest on our podcast talking about the New South. This is something that crosses all kinds of lines in America, doesn't it?
It does. That's why it's so distributing that a majority of white people say, well, there may be some racism someplace, but it's not in my community. It is in each of our communities. It's in the schools, in the neighborhoods, in the job market. And there's no one who's immune from living in a society that is racially unequal and exploitive.
We just don't see it any longer. I mean, if in fact we're living in a small exurb or suburb and we've got limitations in terms of zoning and the like, how much of that do you think is racially, evolved over time?
Well, it's been a long historical racial process. I mean, it started out, of course, with taking land from Native Americans. So all of us live on Native American land, and that's something we need to think about the implication of, because Native Americans are still here, and they're still fighting for land and recognition and sovereignty, and they're still being attacked and marginalized. Many of our communities were, in fact, sundown communities, sundown towns, sometimes in whole states, sometimes just neighborhoods, in which people of color could not live They could not stay overnight. They had to be out by sundown either. And many places had laws and signs about that, but many others it was just tacit agreements or legal covenants in housing contracts and things like that. And so there's a long history of racism that produces white-only space. And today there's still lots of ways that people of color are steered away from white communities. White people are steered towards, and the fear of living with people of color is used to manipulate white potential homeowners and renters. So it's an ongoing process, and that's something that a lot of people are challenging, but there's a need for many more of us who are white people to recognize that when we look around and we see a white-only space or a classroom or a church or a neighborhood or whatever, there's a history there that produces a racially exclusive space, and we can get together with others and address that.
When you look at hundreds of years of injustice from slavery to Jim Crow, and then finally getting our arms around certain of the problems with civil rights legislation, but then wanting it all to go away within a 30 to 50-year period, what does that say about us?
Well, I think it says that, first of all, we don't recognize the depth of the problem, the centrality of race and racism to the history of our country, that we want a quick fix, and that we're not willing to actually do what it takes to stay in there to work for change. We know that the abolition movement was a very long, decades and decades long process. Working for change is slow. It means that we can't just go out this weekend and to a hearing or vote a certain way or do something, a march like the Women's March last year or something like that. We can't just do a one-off action and think that we've done, that we can now go home, and we can't just vote for a black president and say that we're done. The work is ongoing, and a lot of people are involved. It's very exciting and inspiring work. It's very connecting work and healing work, but it takes a commitment to staying in there and really rolling up our sleeves and getting involved for the long haul.
Paul Kivel is with us. The book is called Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. He's updated it. I've got to tell you that when I go on your website, and I find some of the interesting exercises that you ask people to involve themselves in, examining class and race. And you begin with, if your ancestors were forced to come to this country or forced to relocate from where they were living, either temporarily or permanently, or restricted from living in certain areas, take one step backward. If you feel that your primary ethnic identity is American, take one step forward. Tell me what you're trying to do with these exercises and how provocative they are when you get people in groups.
I think one of the things that is hard about doing this work around racism is that it becomes very abstract for white people because we have so little contact with people of color and have so much misinformation. And so we can get into our heads and have a lot of opinions about things and not be very well informed or very kind of on the ground about it. So we've tried to produce a series of exercises where people either stand up or sit down or take a step forward or back in a group exercise so we can actually see the difference that race makes in different people's lives. And so that exercise is for a racially mixed group. They start off on the starting line of a race on a track, all lined up together. But as they respond to these different prompts around their experience around race and class, certain people are stepping backward and some people are stepping forward. And so that by the end of it, you can see just how different the opportunities people have in our society based upon race and class. And then, of course, it's a race for opportunity. And so if you're way in the back of the room and the referee says go, and everybody's trying to get to the front of the room for the best jobs or the best houses, then you don't have the same opportunity that people at the front of the room have. And you might not even feel like it's worth it if there's a limited number of opportunities up there. So it's a way to really, in a more of a physical, emotional way, convey the real impact that racism has on individual people's lives.
What kind of awakening is it for people in your audiences?
Well, it's quite striking because it's undeniable. It's not something you can argue about intellectually. You have to take it in, and then people have a series of feelings about that. They may still want to be in denial or minimization, but in a group process like that, in a group discussion afterwards, there's more room to move further because it was such a powerful visual and physical representation of what race really means in our society.
When you look at media and you look at some of the justice causes of the recent period that have been based on other things beyond race, have we then left race behind? I mean, we've talked about gender equality, a whole range of other things that have come into view in the recent period. Has that been helpful in terms of having allies in this issue of justice for all groups, or has that perhaps left African Americans or race behind?
Well, I don't think it's left it behind. And we need to address the complexity of people's lives and the ways that race and gender and class and disability and other issues impact different people differently. So I think that those tools are really important, and the intersection between issues is really important. Realizing that black women have greater vulnerabilities and greater levels of marginalization than white women, for instance, is really deepens our understanding of both how sexism works and gender and around racism and race. But I think it's more that it's very easy for our political leaders and our corporate leaders to distract our attention around race. We have such a long history of scapegoating people of color that rather than looking at what's really going on economically, it's easy to direct our attention towards immigrants of color or African Americans or Native Americans or Latinx or any group that it's right now Muslims are also and Arab Americans are also part of that. It's just we have to be really careful and wary of the attempt to divert our attention towards people of color who are portrayed always as dangerous and marginal and a source of are outsiders to the U.S. because that really undermines our ability to work together across any of these differences.
How much is fear really playing into all of this, and perhaps our national leaders stoking that in a way, particularly at a time when there are a lot of people, white and black and other, colors, who are looking at America and saying, this is a scary place right now, financially, economically. I'm feeling less secure in my own being, and people are using that as a wedge against ourselves and trying to divide us.
I think that's exactly what's happening. Economically, the standard of living for most white people and people of color in this country has gone progressively downhill since the 1980. And that means that people are losing ground, that their children don't have the opportunities that they had, and tremendous numbers of people have lost their homes or their jobs and are insecure around food and housing. So it's absolutely true that people are worried. They're worried about environmental climate change as well. All of these things feed into it and are amplified by a media and a political system that continually reminds us that people of color are our enemy, are the danger. And it's not true, and it completely undermines our ability to work together to solve the problems that we all face.
Is there also a fear that there's a changing demographic in America, but is that also perhaps the seed of trying to change some of the things that we've been talking about? In other words, there are a lot of children now coming of marriages or relationships that are black and white. There are many people of different cultures coming into America. Is that at the same time the seeds that we have sown for change on a positive side?
Well, I certainly hope so. We have a long history in the U.S. of immigrants being a tremendous source of vitality, and energy and creativity. They've really been a lifeblood for the United States. At the same time, we have a long history of fear of recent immigrants and restrictions on immigration and hate crimes and violence and exploitation of recent immigrants. So there really are both deep lines in U.S. history that are still with us today, and we have to realize that in the long term, we are all here. Everybody has tremendous amounts to contribute, and when we start marginalizing or excluding people, we are working against our best interests.
Paul Kivel, thank you so much for coming by today on a topic that a lot of people don't want to talk about, but we certainly do here on America Trends podcast. And again, the book is called Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice, the 4th revised and updated edition. Thank you again for being our guest today.
Thank you. It's been great to have the conversation with you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of America Trends.